George Janko, who had previously worked with Logan Paul on Impaulsive, now has the fastest growing podcast in the world. But unfortunately, in this episode with Jordan Peterson, that all changed. Welcome back to the Shani Show. George literally apologized for this episode because this is what happens when you don't prep for a podcast, let the ego get the better of you, and try to lecture the great Jordan Peterson. This is a pie chart showing the ratio of how much George talked versus Jordan, next to a pie chart of how much Jordan talked on the Joe Rogan podcast. You can clearly see the discrepancy here. Now, that's not the worst of it, though, because I'm going to show you 3 pivotal moments in the interview where George dropped the ball. The first started with George deciding to get vulnerable with Jordan, although it came across much less like a decision that was prompted from a previous conversation and more so just something that George had clearly planned beforehand. Part of being a great interviewer is to have a set of things you want to cover, but have them come up naturally in conversation. No part of this introduction was natural. Jordan had just finished a really interesting point about how him and his wife deal with dilemmas and how there's no winning an argument in a couple. Now, rather than provide an alternative viewpoint or ask a related question at Jordan's point, George just gives a canned statement and snaps out of the conversation. Take a look.
Because they didn't communicate, right? Exactly.
Yeah. And communication is key.
Biggest thing.
All right, time to get vulnerable.
In this part, George reveals that when him and his fiancée would have sex, George would ask Bella to take her cross off. He wasn't able to perform if she had it on. Which, as a first impression, seems like too much information on a podcast, especially this one. It's not Call Her Daddy, after all. It is an interview with Jordan Peterson. But fans kept an open mind to see where this was going. Unfortunately, it was going nowhere, because instead of getting Jordan's actual perspective on the matter, George is just clearly steering Jordan down a path that he had no interest in going down. Like here, when George reveals that Bella would sometimes forget to put her cross back on after intercourse, and that George saw it as his fault. Now look at how Jordan responds to that.
Sometimes when we carried on through the day, I realized that her cross is off, and that's because of me. And that rocked me.
If Jordan hadn't seen something like that before, he might respond with something like, "Oh wow," or just a standard "okay." But the "oh yeah" was just clearly Jordan signaling that he's seen something like this before. George should have taken that as a signal and gotten the expert's opinion as soon as possible. Instead, look at how George shuts down Jordan's attempt into the conversation, not once, but twice.
I pushed the person that I love the most in the wrong direction, and I know one day I'll be answering to that. And,
well, it looks like you're answering for it right now.
And it was something that was really challenging for me. And it got.
Did you learn?
I'm getting there.
Okay.
And
now you might say that this wasn't George shutting down Jordan, but rather just George finishing his story. Well, George had pretty much been talking without interruptions for 5 minutes straight. Remember, this is the Jordan Peterson interview, not the other way around. What George could have done was answer Jordan's questions right away and then explain how he came to that realization instead of effectively putting Jordan on hold. You can even see subtly that Jordan calmly says okay, with the contrast of George being overly hyper about his story, failing to match the vibe with the interviewee.
When he was pleased with me.
Okay, what had changed?
So I searched for it because I was like, I feel it. It's a spirit. I feel it.
Now, George ends his 8-minute story acting like a son asking his father to validate his insecurities.
What is your thoughts behind this? Am I just a fool trying to look for another way into having sex without...
He could have stopped it at, "What do you make of this?" or even added, "For people out there that are experiencing a similar thing, what would you say to them?" Instead, George deliberately leads the question by saying, "Am I just a fool?" Which is very jarring for 2 reasons. One is he's the one interviewing Jordan. 2, that entire story was just a deliberate attempt to have his idol make him feel less guilty. It just felt super off-putting. Now, Jordan responds saying that George is far more traditional than he wanted to think, and that George felt guilty about telling his mother about it. Instead of George letting Jordan continue about on these points, he aggressively says,
"And so you couldn't face her."
My truth was that I told her already. So I told my parents, like, "Hey guys, I'm just going to be doing this." And I thought that that's my truth.
Right.
But my truth is garbage.
Well,
and again, just like a son to his father saying something overly dramatic and harsh so that the father validates the son. Now, the second point is much more shocking and actually made me quite sad while watching it. Here, Jordan is talking about how he went to a maximum security prison and learned what the inmates were in for. Jordan questioned himself for weeks on whether or not he would even be able to commit the actions they did to end up inside. It's an extremely interesting philosophical tangent that Jordan took. However, look at how George stops Jordan from sharing a very captivating thought.
That's literally the case. Now, what does that mean metaphysically?
I think I went through what you're about to explain to me, and I explained to...
We never got to hear the end of Jordan's point there, but even worse is what George did when Jordan was talking about his wife. Jordan does the opposite of interrupting people. Now, this happened off camera, but George's wife is trying to get a word in, and George isn't letting her. So Jordan ends up stopping George for a moment to say something to his wife. Watch how he handles it in such a genuine way, almost like a father to his daughter.
I want to respect your time because...
You had a question earlier. Do you remember it? Just a bit ago.
I think I was going to add on to when we were talking about forgiveness, but I like the position where we're at.
Okay,
but I appreciate
fine.
you.
I'm so sorry. I'm just like...
The moment that I was referring to earlier about Jordan's wife, and quite frankly, the moment that everyone is talking about, starts when George asked Jordan, how did you manage to have a successful relationship without counsel from God if your wife didn't believe in God? Now, if George did any serious prep for this interview, he'd know that Jordan despises the question or any question revolving around, do you believe in God? Jordan answers the question each time saying, I act as though God exists. Jordan hasn't explicitly said he's a Christian, but just that he's not an atheist. George is pushing his beliefs onto Jordan here, and it's honestly very uncomfortable, which is why you see Jordan respond this way.
How did you manage to have a beautiful, successful relationship without a counsel from God if your wife didn't believe in God while you did? How is that not...
I don't think that wasn't the situation.
So this only gets worse as George continues to pry into Jordan's relationship, acting like he knows much about it.
But where is your counseling? And how do you... So your beliefs are in a higher God and you run your household. How do you run your household when one doesn't want to play ball with the fact that there is a creator out there that gave you a set of instructions to have a beautiful, fruitful relationship?
She did play ball.
Then after Jordan finishes speaking about his daughter's fatal illness, George doesn't ask how Jordan's life has changed since then. No, instead he makes it about his own narrative. Take a look.
As a Christian man, what did it do to you to see your loved one, God forbid, almost leave without knowing God? And we know the repercussions of that. Was that terrifying?
Well, I didn't formulate it that way.
Not only did he just say that Jordan was a Christian when Jordan hasn't, again, explicitly said that, but it came across as extremely insensitive to make that the first question after Jordan had just finished sharing a story about his daughter's fatal illness. Now, the third point leads back to the stark contrast between the Andrew Tate episode and the Jordan Peterson one. It is evidently clear what fame has done to George. In the Tate interview, George is asking questions out of pure curiosity, not pushing a narrative. He doesn't interrupt, nor does he come across as shallow. Instead, we see George acting humble, which was a lot easier back then considering he didn't have the fastest growing podcast at the time. However, the challenge of being humble gets harder and harder the more that you have to be humble about. The audience noticed that discrepancy, which is why it prompted George to make a reaction video. I'm calling it a reaction video, but it was more so an apology to the viewers, and he said that he failed, and he asked questions inappropriately and had no empathy. And I agree with George. I think that was a pretty solid recap of what had happened. So being humble isn't to be taken lightly, which is why Jordan responded this way when George brought up the subject.
But I had to humble myself to be the correct man. And so,
how's that going?
Being humble is not some sort of achievement that you can earn at one point and then forget about later. It is a constant state of mind. I think the episode with Jordan was much more of a therapy session for George than an interview. And honestly, I think this is a pretty unique angle to take the podcast if you wanted to, but it just didn't seem fair to Jordan for this particular episode. This was The Shani Show. If you liked how I broke down this information or disliked it, be sure to leave a comment, and I can't wait to hear from you. Bye.